Picture this. It's the year 1350. You're setting out on the road maybe as a pilgrim, a merchant, or simply to visit family. The world should feel wide and full of promise. But instead, every step is shadowed by danger. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't freedom, it was survival. Muddy roads could trap you, forests hid wolves and bandits, inns spread disease, and rivers could swallow you whole. Even the smallest accident might leave you stranded and doomed. And yet, people still travelled, driven by faith, trade, or desperation. For some, it meant fortune or salvation. For many more, it meant vanishing into history, their stories lost on lonely paths. So, leave behind your modern comforts. No GPS, no safe highways, just the open road and the dangers waiting in the dark. This is the strange dangers of travelling in medieval times. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the roads of medieval Europe. Not the bustling highways of Rome that once connected empires. Not the smooth cobblestones we might imagine from fairy tales. No, the roads of the Middle Ages were often nothing more than dirt tracks, carved by the repeated trudging of hooves, wheels, and weary feet. In summer, they turned to dust, blinding and choking travellers. In winter, they became rivers of mud so deep that wagons would sink to their axles. Rain transformed the earth into a quagmire, sucking at boots, dragging down animals, and leaving entire caravans stranded for days. Even the most seasoned traveller dreaded these paths, because the road itself wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a predator waiting for you to make a mistake. Imagine guiding a wooden cart piled high with goods. The wheels creak and groan as they sink into ruts carved by hundreds of wagons before you. You whip the oxen forward, but one stumbles, pulled down into the muck. The cart tilts. You scramble, pulling at ropes, shouting for help, but no help comes. Hours pass. Your goods spoil in the open air. And if you can't free that ox, you're not just delayed, you're ruined. For a poor merchant, a broken wagon wasn't an inconvenience. It was bankruptcy. And if you thought walking was easier, think again. A single twisted ankle could end your journey entirely. Remember, there were no ambulances, no hospitals waiting at the next town. If your body failed you on the road, you were often left behind. Worse still were the forests that choked many of these roads. Roots jutted out like traps, ready to catch a careless foot. Fallen logs blocked the way, forcing travellers to detour into thickets where wolves might lurk. In some places, the road narrowed so much that two carts could not pass side by side. When this happened, arguments broke out, tempers flared, and sometimes fists or blades were drawn. A bad encounter on a tight road could cost you far more than time. Even bridges, where they existed, were their own hazards. Many were little more than planks laid across a rushing stream. One slip, one rotten board, and you were in the water along with your possessions. And if that stream happened to be swollen from rain, it could sweep you away before you even had a chance to scream. And then there were the tolls. Lords and landowners controlled the stretches of road passing through their domains. A traveller might reach a makeshift gatehouse, only to be told they must pay a fee to cross. Sometimes it was a fair toll. Other times it was extortion, draining the last coins from a poor pilgrim's purse. To refuse was to risk being turned back, or worse. The roads weren't just physical obstacles, they were economic traps as well. Travellers often spoke of roads with dread, not because of bandits or beasts, but because of the sheer unpredictability of the terrain. A sunny morning could end with a flooded ford. A cart full of grain could be lost in a patch of mud, and while a wealthy noble might shrug off such losses, the common traveller could not. For peasants, merchants, and pilgrims, the road was the lifeline that connected villages, towns, and cities. But it was also a battlefield where nature, greed, and bad luck waged war against every step forward. Picture it again, the endless stretch of rutted track, vanishing into the horizon. The groan of wooden wheels, the stink of mud and animals, the silence of a forest closing in on either side. Every mile forward was a test of patience, strength, and survival. These were the treacherous roads of medieval Europe, and if you couldn't master them, you wouldn't live long enough to fear the greater dangers that lay beyond. The road was dangerous enough on its own mud, storms, collapsing bridges. But what truly haunted travellers in the Middle Ages were not wolves or wild boars, but men, desperate men, greedy men, bandits and highwaymen who turned the already treacherous paths into hunting grounds. You see, law and order in the medieval world was a fragile thing. Kings might issue decrees, lords might boast of their authority, but their power rarely stretched beyond the walls of their castles. The countryside, the roads winding through thick forests and lonely hills, was a no-man's land, and wherever authority was weak, predators thrived. Travellers told stories of entire bands of outlaws lurking just out of sight, watching from the tree line as carts and pilgrims plodded along the road. These weren't always ragged men with makeshift weapons. Some were seasoned fighters, disgraced knights, deserters from war, or mercenaries with no more battles to fight. Armed with steel swords, axes, and bows, they could strike with the precision of a trained unit. Imagine walking down a narrow stretch of road, the canopy of trees above, blotting out the Sunday. The path bends, and suddenly you see them, a group of men stepping from the shadows, their faces half covered, weapons glinting in the dim light. The leader raises a hand, not to greet you, but to stop you. You know instantly what this means. There is no negotiation, no appeal to mercy. You hand over your coin, your goods, perhaps even your shoes and cloak. If you resist, you die. And many did die. A wealthy merchant was worth more dead than alive, especially if he resisted. Entire caravans could be slaughtered for their cargo. In fact, the phrase, "your money" or "your life" was no empty threat. It was the grim reality of medieval travel. These bandits weren't always strangers either. Sometimes they were locals, peasants driven to crime by famine or crushing taxes. Other times, they were men hired by corrupt lords to do their dirty work. In some regions, lords themselves turned a blind eye to banditry on their lands, so long as they got a share of the spoils. A traveller couldn't always tell where the outlaw ended and the noble began. Highwaymen grew bold enough that certain stretches of road became infamous. Some routes were so plagued with bandits that people would rather risk longer, harder journeys just to avoid them. Pilgrims, travelling to holy shrines, often moved in large groups, not for companionship, but for survival. Safety in numbers was the only hope, though even large groups weren't safe from ambushes by outlaws who knew the terrain better than anyone. And when the ambushes came, they were swift and brutal. A tree might be felled across the road, blocking your way. As your cart halts, men rush from the bushes, weapons raised. Or an archer's arrow might whistle from the shadows, killing your horse before you even realize you're under attack. Once you were surrounded, escape was nearly impossible. It wasn't just wealth that made travelers targets. Sometimes bandits kidnapped their victims, holding them for ransom. Wealthy nobles and clergy could be worth far more alive if their families or monasteries were willing to pay for their release. But if no ransom came, the captives were often killed anyway, their bodies left to rot in ditches, a warning to others. For the ordinary pilgrim or peasant, travelling with little more than a cloak and a loaf of bread, the terror was just as real. Even if you had nothing of value, bandits might still strip you of your clothes, your shoes, even the food you carried. Left barefoot and starving on the road, many victims never made it to the next village alive. The church, of course, condemned this violence. Kings and lords issued decrees promising justice for victims. But justice was a rare luxury in the wild. Catching bandits was nearly impossible. They vanished into forests, caves, or mountains, places where no sheriff's man dared follow. And when outlaws were caught, their punishment was brutal: hanging, mutilation, sometimes being left in cages to rot as a warning. Yet for every outlaw who swung from a noose, 10 more seemed to rise in his place. Travelers lived with this fear constantly. Every bend in the road, every whisper of branches in the wind could signal an ambush. And, unlike the dangers of weather or wild beasts, bandits struck with intelligence and malice. They weren't just obstacles, they were predators who saw travelers as prey. So when you think of the medieval road, don't imagine a quiet walk through the countryside. Picture instead a gauntlet of shadows, where every step forward might be your last. For in the Middle Ages, the road belonged not to kings, not to pilgrims, not to merchants, but to the bandits waiting in the dark. The forests of medieval Europe were not the romantic woodlands of fairy tales. They were deep, dark, and seemingly endless. To step beneath their canopy was to enter another world, a world where the rules of villages, towns, and kings no longer applied. Travellers who ventured into these green labyrinths did so with dread in their hearts, for the forest was not only vast and confusing, it was alive with dangers. Picture the scene. Towering oaks and pines loom overhead, their branches blotting out the Sunday. The air grows damp and heavy, filled with the smell of moss and rotting leaves. The path beneath your feet is narrow, uneven, and half hidden by roots. Around you, every sound carries too far: the snap of a twig, the distant call of a crow, the rustle of something moving just out of sight. In the Middle Ages, forests were both feared and revered. They were places of mystery, where supernatural forces were said to dwell: witches brewing potions, spirits haunting crossroads, and even demons waiting to ensnare the unwary. Travellers carried charms and muttered prayers as they entered, hoping for protection from unseen forces. But whether or not you believed in ghosts, the very real dangers of the forest were enough to chill the blood. Wild animals were the most obvious threat. Wolves prowled in packs, lean and hungry, especially in the harsh winters when food was scarce. A lone traveller could easily be stalked, his footsteps shadowed by glowing eyes until the moment of attack. A wolf pack might circle in silence before lunging, bringing down a horse and tearing it apart before the rider could even scream. Then there were wild boars, brutish, tusked beasts that could gut a man in a single charge. Hunters feared them, and for good reason. A startled boar crashing through undergrowth could spell instant death for a traveller who strayed too close. Bears, too, roamed the forests of northern Europe, and though they avoided humans when possible, a mother protecting her cubs was more dangerous than any blade-wielding thief. But animals weren't the only menace. The forest itself was treacherous. Dense undergrowth could slow a traveller to a crawl. Thick fogs could descend without warning, leaving even seasoned woodsmen lost for hours or days. Stray too far from the road, and you risked wandering in circles until exhaustion or starvation claimed you. Many who disappeared into the woods were never seen again. Their bones became part of the forest floor, hidden beneath leaves and moss. Bandits also favoured the cover of trees. A forest provided the perfect hiding place for ambushes. A gang could watch from the shadows, waiting until a traveller was hemmed in by trees, with no space to flee. To be attacked in a forest was especially terrifying, for even if you escaped, your cries for help would echo uselessly into the endless green. Villages were often miles away, and no one would hear you. Then came the superstitions. For medieval people, the forest was thick with omens. Strange noises and owls' call. The sudden snapping of branches were taken as signs of misfortune. Many believed witches gathered in clearings to dance under the moon, or that crossroads in the woods were places where the devil himself could appear. Tales of travellers vanishing in the night fed these fears, and every rustle in the trees felt like proof of dark forces lurking nearby. Even the smell of the forest could turn against you. Imagine traveling for days, the only food in your pouch gone stale. You catch the scent of smoke, perhaps a fire. Hope stirs in your chest. But was it a camp of fellow travelers, or an outlaw's lair, waiting to lure the hungry and the desperate closer? Trusting the wrong fire could mean losing not only your possessions, but your life. For those who survived the forests, the experience left a lasting mark. Many travelers described the woods not just as places of danger, but as places of loneliness and silence. The isolation could gnaw at the mind. A man walking alone might begin to imagine shapes in the trees, faces in the bark, or whispers in the wind. Some said the forest drove men mad long before wolves or bandits could claim them, and yet, despite the fear, the forests could not be avoided. They stretched across Europe, separating towns and cities, standing between pilgrims and holy sites, merchants and their markets. To reach your destination, you had to face them, and every time you stepped beneath their branches, you knew the truth. You were entering a world where death could come quietly, from the shadows, and no one would ever know what became of you. These were the forests of fear, vast, silent, and deadly. And for medieval travelers, they were a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying enemies were not men with swords, but the dark wilderness itself. If the forests and the bandits didn't kill you, something far smaller often did. For medieval travelers, disease was a constant, invisible threat, an enemy you couldn't fight with a sword or shield. It lingered in every filthy inn, every crowded caravan, every cup of water drawn from a roadside well. To set out on a journey was to gamble not only with bandits and beasts, but with your own health. Picture yourself arriving in a small town after days of trudging along muddy roads. You're tired, hungry, desperate for rest. The only lodging you can afford is a rough inn on the edge of the square. Inside, the air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, smoke, and ale gone sour. Dozens of travellers share the same cramped space. The beds are little more than straw pallets crawling with fleas and lice. You tell yourself you'll only stay one night, but one night is all it takes. By morning, you're coughing. By evening, you're burning with fever. Diseases spread like wildfire along medieval roads. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, they all carried sickness with them. Dysentery, cholera, and food poisoning were common companions on any long journey. Unsanitary conditions ensured that once one person fell ill, others quickly followed. Inns, taverns, and marketplaces became breeding grounds for contagion. But the greatest terror of all was the plague. The Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, carried in part by travelling merchants, sailors, and pilgrims. A single sick traveller could bring an entire town to its knees within weeks. Fear of plague became so widespread that travellers were often shunned, turned away from villages, even attacked, as locals suspected them of carrying death on their breath. To be a stranger on the road was to be a potential threat to everyone you encountered. Even without plague, the dangers were grim. Stagnant water sources along the road often carried parasites or deadly bacteria. Desperate travellers drank anyway, quenching their thirst at the cost of their health. A sip from the wrong stream could mean days of agonizing cramps, vomiting, and dehydration, often fatal in a world without modern medicine. Food, too, was a danger. Merchants might carry dried meat, bread, or cheese, but food spoiled quickly, especially in summer. Mouldy bread could bring hallucinations and sickness, thanks to ergot fungus. Rotten meat might sicken a traveller beyond recovery. For the poor, who couldn't afford fresh supplies at every stop, eating spoiled food was often a matter of survival. Then there were the wounds. A blister from a long walk, a cut from a broken cartwheel, a bite from an insect, these might seem minor today, but in the Middle Ages they could be lethal. Without proper medicine, infections spread quickly. A festering wound might swell, turn black, and kill within days. Travellers often carried knives, not just for protection, but for cutting away infected flesh in desperate attempts to save themselves. Imagine the paranoia. Every cough on the road could signal sickness. Every stranger who stumbled into an inn might bring death with him. People covered their faces, muttered prayers, or avoided contact entirely. Yet, for many, avoiding contact was impossible. Pilgrims travelled in great groups, huddled together for safety. Merchants relied on crowded markets. Soldiers marched in tight columns. Disease thrived wherever men gathered. And when disease struck, the journey often ended. There were no hospitals waiting to take in sick travellers. Villages feared outsiders too much to care for them. A man who fell ill on the road was often abandoned, left to die in a ditch or beneath a tree. His body, once lifeless, might be robbed, stripped, or ignored entirely. This reality gave rise to strange customs. Some travellers carried small religious relics, believing they would ward off sickness. Others wore charms of herbs like garlic or sage, thought to repel disease. Doctors, even the most respected, insisted on fumigations, amulets, or leeches. But the truth was simple. Once disease took hold, no charm or prayer could save you. The irony was bitter. Travel was often undertaken for holy reasons to reach a shrine, a relic, or a pilgrimage site in hopes of miraculous healing. Yet the very act of travelling increased the chance of catching a disease that would kill you before you reached your destination. The road to salvation was often a road to sickness. For medieval travellers, death from disease was rarely quick or merciful. It was slow, painful, and humiliating. To die in a ditch, writhing in fever, with no family or priest by your side, was the nightmare that haunted every step of the journey, and it was a nightmare many never escaped. Disease made the medieval road more than a test of strength. It was a test of luck. You could survive the bandits, outlast the storms, and endure the forests, only to be undone by a single sip of water, a single flea bite, or a single night in a crowded inn. On the medieval road, you never travelled alone. Sickness always walked beside you. By the time you'd spent a day trudging through mud, fending off hunger, and listening for the whisper of bandits in the trees, the thought of an inn must have felt like salvation. A warm fire, a roof overhead, perhaps even a meal and a bed, it was the promise every traveller clung to when the night closed in. But in the Middle Ages, inns were not the safe havens we imagine today. They were places of danger, squalor, and betrayal. A weary traveller might step through their doors hoping for rest, only to find themselves robbed, poisoned, or dead before morning. Picture the scene. You push open a heavy wooden door, the stench of sweat, smoke, and stale ale hitting you like a wall. Inside, the common room is crowded. Merchants, peasants, pilgrims, and the occasional soldier sit hunched over mugs, their faces hidden by shadows. The innkeeper eyes you as you enter, not with kindness, but with calculation. To him, you're not a guest. You're a purse waiting to be emptied. Beds, if they existed, were rarely private. Most inns offered a straw mattress in a communal room, where strangers lay shoulder to shoulder, coughing and snoring through the night. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the filthy bedding, carrying disease from one traveller to the next. To sleep in an inn was to risk waking up covered in bites or worse, never waking up at all. Robbery was a constant threat. Innkeepers were often in league with thieves. A traveller who carried visible wealth, fine clothes, a heavy purse, a jewelled cross might be given a bed in the darkest corner of the inn, where bandits could slip in during the night. Many never made it to dawn. Their bodies might be dumped in a ditch, while their possessions were divided between innkeeper and outlaw. Even meals could not be trusted. Food was often spoiled, watered down, or deliberately tampered with. A traveller too hungry to notice might eat a stew laced with herbs that caused sickness, or drink ale mixed with strange powders. Poisoning was not unheard of, especially if a guest seemed wealthy enough to make robbery worthwhile. The unlucky victim would collapse, helpless, while the thieves stripped him of everything he owned. And yet, even without deliberate treachery, the inns themselves were breeding grounds for illness. Travellers from all corners of the land gathered under one roof, coughing, sneezing, spreading disease in the stagnant air. The straw floors were soaked with ale and urine. Rats scurried across the rafters. Cats prowled to keep the vermin at bay, but their efforts did little. To share a meal or a bed in such conditions was to invite sickness into your body. Then there was the violence. Inns were gathering places for men who lived rough lives, soldiers between wars, mercenaries for hire, outlaws on the run. Drink flowed freely, tempers flared quickly, and brawls often broke out. A traveller unlucky enough to get caught in one might find himself beaten bloody, or worse. Knives flashed in the smoky air, mugs became weapons, and the innkeeper rarely interfered. Violence kept the ale flowing, after all. Women travelling alone, or even with small groups, faced particular danger. Inns were not places of safety for them. Harassment, assault, and abduction were grim realities. The law rarely intervened, and an innkeeper was more likely to protect his reputation than a vulnerable guest. Superstition added yet another layer of fear. Many believed inns were cursed places, tainted by the sins and violence that happened within their walls. Stories spread of travellers who vanished after a night's stay, their spirits forever trapped inside. Crossroads inns, in particular, carried sinister reputations. They were said to be haunts for witches and demons, feeding on the souls of the desperate. Whether or not you believed such tales, the unease they created was very real. And yet, travellers had little choice. To sleep outside was to risk wolves, thieves, or freezing in the night air. To sleep inside was to risk robbery, sickness, or worse. It was a cruel choice, the forest or the inn. Many chose the inn, believing numbers offered safety. But numbers only made it easier for disease and treachery to flourish. So when we imagine medieval inns, let us strip away the romantic images of roaring fires and cheerful hosts. The reality was far darker. These were not havens of comfort, but traps disguised as shelter. A place where the desperate and the greedy rubbed shoulders, where the traveller's weariness made him vulnerable, and where survival was never guaranteed. For the medieval traveller, the most dangerous part of the journey might not have been the road itself, but the bed he chose to rest in. In the modern world, we think little of rivers. Bridges carry us across in seconds, ferries glide safely from bank to bank, and even the widest waters are easily tamed. But for a traveller in the Middle Ages, a river was not just an obstacle, it was a deadly adversary. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed with rivers, from great torrents like the Rhine and the Danube, to countless smaller streams that wound through fields and forests. Each one posed a threat. For a weary traveller, crossing water could mean the difference between reaching your destination or being swallowed by the current forever. Bridges did exist, of course, but they were rare, costly, and often treacherous in their own right. Many were little more than wooden planks lashed together, swaying and rotting in the elements. Heavy carts strained their beams, horses slipped on slick surfaces, and entire sections sometimes collapsed without warning. To set foot on a medieval bridge was to place your life in the hands of timbers and nails that might give way at any moment. Stone bridges, sturdier and longer lasting, were symbols of wealth and power, but they were jealously controlled. Lords who built them charged tolls so steep that poor travellers often avoided them entirely. Imagine trudging for days only to find yourself at a toll gate, the guard demanding coins you cannot spare. Refusal meant turning back or risking the waters below. For those unwilling or unable to pay, fords were the only alternative. These shallow crossings offered the promise of passage, but they were riddled with danger. What looked like calm, knee-deep water might conceal a slick, uneven bed of rocks. A single misstep could send a horse stumbling, a cart toppling, or a man tumbling into the current. And once the current caught you, there was little hope. Medieval travellers rarely knew how to swim. To fall was, more often than not, to drown. Worse still, rivers were unpredictable. A sudden rainstorm upstream could turn a gentle stream into a raging torrent within hours. Floods swept away wagons, livestock, and entire groups of pilgrims. Many who attempted to cross after a storm were never seen again. Their possessions drifted downstream. Their bodies found days later tangled in reeds. Travellers with goods faced extra challenges. Merchants transporting wool, grain, or spices had to guard against water damage, often wrapping their wares in cloth or skins. But one slip, one overturned cart, and a fortune could be lost to the river in seconds. A merchant ruined by such a loss might never recover his livelihood swept away before his eyes. Then there were the ferrymen. Where no bridges stood, ferries often filled the gap. But ferrymen were not always trustworthy. Some charged exorbitant prices, preying on the desperation of travellers. Others overloaded their rafts, pushing them beyond safety to squeeze out more coins. Tales abound of ferries capsizing, their passengers dragged down by the weight of their own armour or possessions. And ferrymen had reputations for more sinister crimes too. A lone traveller stepping aboard at dusk might never make it to the opposite shore. Instead, the ferryman could take his life and his goods, dumping the body into the current to vanish without a trace. It was a chilling thought. The man you paid to carry you across might be the very one to end your journey. Superstition only deepened the fear. Rivers were seen as liminal spaces, boundaries between worlds. Many believed spirits or demons lingered in their depths, ready to drag down the unwary. Offerings were sometimes made before a crossing, coins tossed into the water, prayers whispered for safe passage. To ignore such rituals was to tempt fate itself. Even when crossings succeeded, the fear never truly left. Travellers spoke of the sound of rushing water echoing in their dreams, of the cold grip of unseen hands pulling at their boots. For those who survived a near drowning, the memory haunted them for life. Crossing a river in the Middle Ages was never just a matter of getting to the other side. It was a test of courage, luck, and faith. You could prepare carefully, choose your spot wisely, and still lose everything in an instant. And as you dried your boots on the far bank, relief flooding your chest, you knew one thing with certainty. The river had spared you this time, but it would not spare everyone. For on the medieval road, even water was an enemy. In the medieval world, travellers didn't just battle bandits, beasts, or rivers. They fought something far greater, far less predictable, and utterly merciless: the weather. Today, we check forecasts, carry umbrellas, or find shelter when storms roll in. But in the Middle Ages, the sky itself was a dangerous adversary, one that could kill without warning. Picture yourself on the road. The day begins fair, the sun warm on your back, a cool breeze stirring the fields, but by midday the clouds darken. A storm brews, the wind howls, and rain begins to fall in sheets. The dirt road beneath your boots dissolves into sucking mud, each step heavier than the last. The cart you've been hauling creaks and shudders, wheels sinking deeper, until at last it lurches to a halt. You look around for shelter, but there is none. No inn, no hut, not even a barn. Just endless fields and the merciless sky. Rain was more than an inconvenience. Soaked clothes chilled the body to the bone, inviting fever and pneumonia. A single night shivering in wet rags could end in death. For the poor, who had little more than wool cloaks or thin tunics, there was no real protection from the elements. Then there was snow. In the depths of winter, roads disappeared entirely beneath drifts. Travellers could lose their way in white wastelands where every direction looked the same. Hypothermia struck swiftly. Fingers and toes blackened with frostbite, limbs stiffened, and men collapsed in the snow, sometimes only a few miles from safety, their frozen bodies found months later when the thaw came. Summer carried dangers of its own. With little shade along the roads, the sun could scorch travellers relentlessly. Heatstroke was common, especially for those burdened with heavy armour, goods, or clothing. Dehydration struck fast. Wells and streams often dried up in the heat, leaving pilgrims and peasants desperate for water. A man might collapse in the dust, lips cracked, tongue swollen, his body as dry as the road itself. Storms were the most terrifying of all. Thunder rolled across the skies like the wrath of God, and lightning split the heavens. Many believed storms were punishments for sin, sent to strike down the wicked. Travellers caught in the open prayed desperately as lightning lanced the fields, sometimes killing men and animals outright. Horses bolted in terror, carts overturned, and possessions scattered in the rain. Wind, too, had its dangers. A sudden gale could knock a traveller from his horse or push a ferry adrift mid-crossing. On mountain passes, gusts tore at cloaks and packs, sending unwary men tumbling into ravines. There were stories of travellers who vanished in storms, their bodies never recovered, snatched by the winds and cast into oblivion. And then there were floods. Heavy rains swelled rivers and streams, turning meadows into lakes and washing out entire sections of road. Travellers might wake to find their camp surrounded by rising water, their supplies soaked, their horses panicked. Floodwaters carried debris, logs, branches, even the carcasses of animals that could smash carts or drown the unwary. The psychological toll of weather was immense. Imagine weeks on the road beneath unending rain, clothes never dry, food sodden and spoiled. Spirits broke under such conditions. Some abandoned their journeys entirely, choosing the risk of poverty at home over the endless misery of the road. Superstition added another layer of fear. Medieval people believed storms and harsh weather were signs of divine displeasure. To be caught in a storm was to be tested by God or cursed by witches. Pilgrims sometimes turned back from their holy journeys, convinced the heavens themselves opposed their path. Others pressed on, whispering prayers with every clap of thunder, clutching relics and charms to their chests. Yet, despite all the risks, the weather could not be avoided. Crops, trade, and survival demanded movement, no matter the season. Merchants braved winter roads to sell their wares. Pilgrims trudged through rain and mud, seeking salvation. Messengers carried royal orders across storm-lashed fields, knowing delay might mean execution. The sky could kill, but duty and desperation forced men and women to face it anyway. In truth, the medieval traveller walked not just the road, but a tightrope between earth and sky. Each step forward carried the risk of freezing, burning, or drowning beneath the elements. And there was no guarantee that tomorrow's sunrise would bring relief. The weather was not just background, it was a weapon, wielded by fate itself. And for countless travellers, it was the final, merciless blow. In the medieval world, travel was rarely undertaken lightly. Most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, tied to the land by feudal duty and the sheer difficulty of movement. But there was one reason ordinary men and women set aside their fears, left their homes, and stepped onto the treacherous roads. Faith. Pilgrimages were among the most common and most dangerous forms of travel in the Middle Ages. Driven by devotion, desperation, or hope for forgiveness, pilgrims set out on long journeys to holy sites, believing that each weary step brought them closer to salvation. Yet for many, the journey itself became a trial of suffering, disease, and death. Imagine a peasant family kneeling before their parish priest. A child lies sick, and the parents beg God for healing. The priest advises a pilgrimage to Canterbury, to Santiago de Compostela, perhaps even to Rome or Jerusalem if fortune allows. They gather what little food and coin they can spare, sling bundles over their shoulders, and step out into the unknown. The child, feverish and weak, is carried in arms or on a makeshift cart. Their hope is bound to faith, but their chances of survival are bound to the cruelty of the road. Pilgrims faced all the dangers of ordinary travellers, bandits, storms, disease, and treacherous terrain, but multiplied by distance. The most famous sites often lay hundreds, even thousands of miles away. To reach them could take months or years. Along the way, pilgrims slept in fields, begged for food at monasteries, and trudged through mud, snow, and hostile lands. Many never returned. The roads to shrines were often crowded with fellow pilgrims. On one hand, this offered some safety in numbers. On the other, it created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Fleas, lice, dysentery, and fevers swept through pilgrim groups like wildfire. Entire bands of travellers fell sick together, and sometimes whole villages barred them from entering, fearing they carried plague. Then there was hunger. Pilgrims often relied on charity, but charity was scarce in times of famine. Many were reduced to eating scraps, weeds, or spoiled food scavenged along the road. Children starved. Adults collapsed from exhaustion. The holy journey that was supposed to save lives often ended them. Even when pilgrims reached their destination, danger remained. The great shrines were crowded, chaotic places. Pilgrims pressed shoulder to shoulder in hopes of touching relics or altars, sometimes trampling one another in the frenzy. Opportunistic thieves worked the crowds, cutting purses and slipping away before anyone noticed. Pickpockets preyed especially on the sick and weary the very people who had come in hope of healing. Some pilgrims travelled not for healing but for penance. A murderer might be sentenced by the church to walk barefoot to Rome, or a thief to journey to Santiago in chains. These penitential pilgrims were easily recognized, often mocked, and sometimes attacked on the road. Their suffering was meant to cleanse their souls, but it often destroyed their bodies long before redemption could be claimed. The longest and most perilous pilgrimage of all was to the Holy Land. To reach Jerusalem required crossing seas infested with pirates, deserts scorched by the sun, and lands contested by war. Pilgrims bound for Jerusalem often joined massive groups, travelling under the protection of armed escorts. Yet even then, disease, hunger, and violence cut many down before they ever glimpsed the walls of the holy city. And yet, despite the dangers, pilgrimages thrived. Shrines grew rich from offerings, towns prospered from the steady stream of weary travellers, and the church praised the journeys as acts of supreme devotion. For the pilgrims themselves, the suffering was part of the point. Each blister, each pang of hunger, each peril endured was seen as a step closer to heaven. To die on the road, even to collapse at the gates of a shrine, was considered a holy death. But faith could not erase fear. As pilgrims trudged forward, they whispered prayers not only for forgiveness, but for survival. Every shadow in the forest, every rumble of thunder, every cough in the crowded inn, reminded them of how thin the line was between salvation and death. To undertake a pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was to surrender yourself completely to God, to fate, and to the mercy or cruelty of the road. For some, it was a journey of spiritual triumph. For many others, it was a one-way path into the grave. In the medieval world, knowing where you were going was often as dangerous as the journey itself. Today we pull out a phone, tap a map, and follow glowing lines with certainty. But in the Middle Ages, maps were not guides, they were guesses. And following one could lead you into wilderness, enemy territory, or even your death. To start, maps were rare and costly. Most peasants never laid eyes on one in their entire lives. The few that existed were hand-drawn by monks or scholars, copied from older charts, and riddled with errors. They were not practical road maps as we know them today. Instead, they were often spiritual or symbolic, showing the world as God's creation rather than as an accurate tool for travel. Take the famous Mappa Mundi of the medieval age. These vast circular maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, with distant lands like Africa and Asia stretching out in distorted shapes. Rivers wound in fanciful loops, seas were filled with drawings of monstrous fish, and unexplored regions brimmed with imagined creatures, dog-headed men, cannibals, and lands where the sun never set. Useful for a scholar's study? Perhaps. Useful for a traveller on the road? Not at all. For those who needed to move from one town to another, verbal directions were far more common than maps. A merchant might be told, "Follow the river until the third ford, then take the path that bends left toward the hills." But what if the river split? What if floods erased the ford? A single wrong turn could lead a traveller miles off course, deeper into forests or swamps where bandits lurked and wild animals prowled. Even when rudimentary maps of regions or roads existed, they were far from reliable. Distances were misjudged, landmarks misplaced, and entire villages left off the parchment. A castle might be marked miles from its true location, a mountain range shrunk to a mere line, a river drawn as a trickle, when in reality it was an impassable torrent. Travellers who trusted such maps often found themselves hopelessly lost. Worse still, not all maps were made with good intentions. Lords and merchants sometimes commissioned maps that exaggerated their own lands or obscured rival territories. Political bias crept onto parchment, making navigation even more treacherous. A stranger, relying on such a map, could walk straight into enemy land, mistaken for a spy, and end up swinging from a noose. Night brought another difficulty. With no stars to guide them, as only trained sailors truly understood celestial navigation, land travellers fumbled blindly if they strayed from the main road. Torches illuminated little more than the mud at their feet. To lose the path after dark was to risk stumbling into rivers, marshes, or ambushes. Superstition further tangled the problem of direction. Some travellers believed certain crossroads were cursed, that spirits lured wanderers astray, or that witches twisted paths to trap the unwary. If a man vanished while travelling, it was often said he had been led away by otherworldly forces. Maps offered no protection against such fears, if anything. Their strangeness made them seem more mystical than practical. Pilgrims, in particular, were vulnerable. Many set out with little knowledge of the world beyond their own village, clutching crude sketches passed from one pilgrim to the next. Some made it to holy shrines, others disappeared forever, their bones hidden in forests or lying in shallow graves by the roadside. The very act of stepping beyond one's known world was a gamble against uncertainty. Merchants fared slightly better, for trade routes became well worn over time, but even they could be undone by poor directions. A caravan travelling toward a market might miss a crucial fork in the road and waste days circling back. In the meantime, goods spoiled, horses weakened, and profits dwindled. For a merchant, a bad map wasn't just inconvenient, it was ruinous. The most chilling fact was that getting lost often meant death. Stray too far from villages and monasteries, and you risk starvation, exposure, or wolves. There were no signposts, no mile markers, nothing to guide you back. Once the road was gone, so too was your chance of survival. To travel in the Middle Ages was to step into a maze without a plan. A parchment sketch might help, or it might doom you. Each turn of the road carried the question, am I heading towards salvation, or am I wandering into the jaws of death? For many medieval travellers, the truth was simple. The map was as much an enemy as the road itself. When we think of medieval war, we imagine knights in gleaming armour, banners waving proudly, and great battles fought on open fields. But for the common traveller, war was not a spectacle. It was a nightmare that turned every road into a trap and every village into a battlefield. To journey through a land at war was to step into chaos, where survival depended on luck as much as on caution. The Middle Ages were rife with conflict. Feuding nobles, rival kingdoms, and foreign invaders left vast swathes of Europe in near-constant turmoil. Borders shifted like sand. One year a road might pass peacefully through a lord's territory. The next, it could lie in the middle of a battlefield. Travellers rarely knew which flags flew ahead or which armies they might stumble upon. For a peasant or pilgrim on the road, the greatest danger came not from the clash of knights, but from the devastation that followed them. Armies marched like locusts, consuming everything in their path. Crops were trampled or stolen, livestock driven off, villages burned to deny supplies to the enemy. To wander into such a wasteland was to find nothing but ashes and hunger. And then there were the soldiers themselves. For medieval armies, civilians were easy prey. A lone traveller carrying goods was a target for looting. Soldiers often justified robbery as spoils of war, and resistance could mean death. Even those carrying nothing of value risked being pressed into service, forced to haul supplies, dig trenches, or act as guides. To refuse was to be cut down where they stood. Mercenary bands were worse still. Hired swords with no loyalty beyond their pay, they roamed freely between conflicts, plundering villages and ambushing travellers. Known as free companies in France, or routiers in other regions, these men lived by theft and violence when not employed by kings. For the unlucky traveller, crossing paths with such a band meant either surrendering everything or joining the countless corpses they left behind. Sieges brought their own perils. Castles and walled towns became death traps, and the surrounding countryside turned into a wasteland. Travellers caught near a siege risked being mistaken for spies or smugglers. Some were hanged as examples, their bodies left swinging by the roadside. Others were simply swept into the chaos, starved alongside besieged townsfolk or killed by arrows loosed at random. Even after a battle ended, the danger remained. Battlefields were littered with corpses, men, horses, and sometimes civilians caught in the fighting. The stench of death carried for miles. Wolves and crows gathered in great numbers, feasting on the remains. Disease spread swiftly from rotting bodies and blood-soaked soil. A traveller, stumbling upon such a scene, risked sickness just from breathing the air. Roads themselves became traps. Armies dug trenches, destroyed bridges, or blocked passages to delay their enemies, leaving travellers stranded. Land that once offered safe passage turned into a maze of ruined paths, forcing detours through forests or marshes. Each step away from the road increased the risk of getting lost or being attacked by bandits who thrived in the chaos. The psychological strain was crushing. To walk through a land scarred by war was to live in constant fear. Fear of meeting soldiers on patrol, fear of stumbling across an ambush, fear of being accused of treachery by one side or the other. Even innocent words could lead to suspicion. Speaking the wrong dialect, carrying the wrong token, or travelling at the wrong time could end in execution. And yet, travellers could not always avoid war zones. Pilgrims pressed on despite the dangers, convinced their journey was divinely protected. Merchants risked war-torn roads to sell their goods, gambling that profit outweighed peril. Messengers had no choice at all. Royal orders had to be delivered, even if it meant passing through fields where corpses still lay unburied. For those who survived, the memory of such journeys never faded. They spoke of villages reduced to smouldering ruins, of families begging for food along the road, of soldiers' laughter as they robbed men of their last possessions. To them, war was not glory, it was horror made flesh. To travel through a medieval war zone was to gamble with every step. You might emerge on the other side, battered but alive. Or you might vanish into the endless list of nameless dead, another casualty of a conflict you never chose to fight. In the medieval world, danger didn't always come from bandits lurking in the woods or storms tearing across the sky. Sometimes it came from the very people you were forced to rely on: the villagers, townsfolk, and farmers whose lands you passed through on your journey. To be a stranger on the road was to be viewed with suspicion, and often with outright hostility. Most medieval people lived their entire lives within a day's walk of their birthplace. Outsiders were rare, and when they appeared, they raised questions. Who were they? What did they want? Were they merchants, pilgrims, or spies? In a time when feuds between lords were common and bandits disguised themselves as harmless travelers, suspicion was a matter of survival. Imagine entering a small village at dusk. Smoke curls from the chimneys, chickens scratch in the dirt, and weary farmers glance up from their work. To you, it looks peaceful, but to them, you are an intruder. Children are ushered indoors. Doors close quietly. Conversations hush. The weight of 100 eyes follows you as you step onto the main road, and though no one speaks, the message is clear. You are not welcome here. If you tried to seek shelter, you might be turned away or worse, accused of ill intent. Inns existed in towns and along busy routes, but in smaller villages, hospitality was far from guaranteed. A farmer might offer you straw in his barn, or he might report you to the local reeve, suspecting you of theft or witchcraft. Stories spread quickly in rural communities, and a single false rumor could see a stranger beaten or even killed. Foreign travelers had it the hardest. A man speaking a different dialect, wearing unfamiliar clothing, or carrying unusual goods might be mistaken for an enemy scout. In border regions especially, suspicion could be deadly. A lone traveller accused of spying might be dragged before the local lord or simply executed on the spot. Justice was swift, brutal, and often wrong. Pilgrims, though theoretically respected, were not immune. While some villages opened their doors to holy travellers, others saw them as little more than beggars and thieves. Groups of pilgrims passing through could strain a village's limited resources, devouring food, water, and shelter meant for locals. Resentment built quickly, and hospitality could turn to hostility overnight. Merchants fared little better. While towns thrived on trade, rural folk often saw merchants as greedy outsiders who brought high prices and little benefit. A merchant carrying coins or exotic goods risked being cheated at best, robbed at worst. In some cases, villagers banded together to ambush traders, justifying their theft as reclaiming what was fair. Superstition made matters worse. Disease often followed travellers, whether plague, fever, or dysentery, and locals sometimes blamed strangers for spreading it. A coughing traveller might be accused of carrying pestilence. In desperate times, accusations of witchcraft or curses were hurled at outsiders, and frightened mobs could mete out punishment without trial. Even harmless actions could arouse suspicion. Asking too many questions about a village's layout might look like scouting for bandits. Approaching livestock could be seen as an attempt at theft. A poorly timed glance at a local's daughter might invite violence. In a world where honour, land, and survival were fragile, strangers walked a razor's edge. The traveller's options were few. One could move quickly through settlements, keeping interactions brief and avoiding offence. Or one could rely on religious symbols, wearing a pilgrim's badge, carrying a rosary, or seeking the protection of a monastery. Churches were often the safest havens, as even suspicious villagers hesitated to attack those under God's roof. Still, not all encounters ended in hostility. Some villagers were curious, even welcoming. A wandering minstrel might be invited to share songs, a pilgrim to share tales of holy relics, a merchant to display strange goods. But such kindness was the exception, not the rule. For the medieval traveller, every village was a gamble. Would the locals offer bread and a bed of straw, or suspicion and a knife in the dark? The truth was, you never knew until you stepped into their world, a stranger in a land where strangers were rarely trusted. To survive, you had to carry more than coins and courage. You had to carry silence, humility, and the wisdom to know when to move on before suspicion turned to danger. If danger on the medieval road often came with the sword or the storm, another enemy was far quieter and far more constant: hunger and thirst. In the Middle Ages, finding safe food and clean water was never guaranteed. For the traveller, every mouthful carried a risk not only of starvation if it was absent, but of sickness if it was spoiled. Imagine setting out on a pilgrimage or merchant's journey. You pack bread, cheese, and perhaps a little salted meat, but provisions run out quickly, and what remains spoils. Bread goes stale within days. Cheese grows mould. Meat, unless heavily salted or smoked, begins to rot in the heat. After a week on the road, your supplies are no longer food, but poison. And so begins the desperate search for sustenance along the way. Villages and towns sometimes offered relief. A monastery might share bread with pilgrims, or an inn might provide stew to weary guests. But charity was never assured, and inns charged dearly for their meals. A poor traveller could rarely afford both shelter and food, forced to choose between hunger or a cold night outdoors. Water was a greater danger still. Today we think of a stream or well as fresh and pure, but in the Middle Ages, most water sources were teeming with filth. Wells were often shallow, easily contaminated by nearby latrines or rotting waste. Rivers and streams carried not just water, but the refuse of villages, the blood of slaughterhouses, and the corpses of animals. To drink without boiling was to gamble with one's life. Dysentery, cholera, and fevers struck down countless travellers, leaving them doubled over with pain, too weak to continue, sometimes dead by the roadside. Some attempted to avoid the risk by drinking ale or wine instead, as these were safer. But ale was weak and spoiled quickly, while wine was costly and often watered down. For most, water remained the only choice, no matter how dangerous. A thirsty traveller who refused a suspicious stream might collapse long before he found a better source. Food along the road was no longer reliable. Foraging provided some relief: berries, nuts, roots, but misidentification was deadly. Many plants were poisonous, and without the knowledge of an herbalist, a hungry traveller might seal his fate with a single bite. Meat could be hunted or trapped, but carrying the tools, the skill, and the time for such pursuits was beyond most pilgrims or merchants. Spoiled food was another constant threat. A piece of bread with hidden mould, a stew left too long on the fire, or a fish taken from a polluted stream could kill as surely as a sword. Food poisoning was swift and merciless, striking down even the strong. On the road, there was no physician to help, no medicine beyond herbs and prayer. Starvation loomed especially during times of famine. In years of poor harvest, even villages struggled to feed themselves. Travellers arriving at such times were met not with bread, but with cold stares. To ask for food was to compete with children already on the brink of hunger. Many were turned away, left to wither along the road, while locals clung desperately to their meagre supplies. Some turned to theft in desperation. A stolen chicken or loaf might mean another day alive, but if caught, the punishment could be brutal. Travellers were hanged for less, their bodies displayed as a warning to others. Hunger drove many to gamble with their lives, but the dice rarely fell kindly. Superstition shaped how people thought about hunger and thirst too. Many believed spoiled food or poisoned wells were the work of witches, curses laid upon the land. Pilgrims often carried charms against bad water, though faith alone did little to protect them. Desperation made travellers pray before every meal, not only for nourishment, but for survival. For the lucky, hospitality did exist. Some villages took pride in feeding pilgrims, believing charity would earn them God's favour. A weary merchant might find a farmer willing to share bread in exchange for stories or news from afar. These moments of kindness stood out like stars in the dark sky of hardship. but they were rare and never guaranteed. For the medieval traveller, every sip and every bite carried the same question: will this keep me alive, or will it be the end of me? Hunger hollowed the body, thirst cracked the lips, and desperation pressed upon the soul. Of all the dangers of the road, this was the most constant, the slow, gnawing enemy that never slept. The medieval road was not just filled with physical dangers: wolves, bandits, storms, and starvation. It was also haunted by fears less tangible, yet just as powerful: superstition and the unseen world. For a traveller in the Middle Ages, every sound in the night, every shadow in the woods, every bird overhead might be a sign of doom. Medieval people lived in a world saturated with belief. God, saints, angels, and demons were thought to walk alongside men at every turn. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and to journey far from home was to leave behind familiar protections. On the open road, travellers were exposed not only to earthly dangers, but to spirits, curses, and the will of fate itself. Omens were everywhere. The sudden cry of an owl in the night was a bad sign. Death was thought to follow such a sound. A raven circling overhead could mean disaster. If you stumbled as you began a journey, it was believed unwise to continue. Some even turned back entirely, convinced that to go on was to invite tragedy. Crossroads were especially feared. They were seen as places where the supernatural lingered, where witches performed rituals, where the devil might appear, or where restless spirits wandered. Travellers avoided them at night, whispering prayers if they had no choice but to pass. Many crossroads bore gallows too, the bodies of executed criminals left hanging as both warning and curse. To sleep near such a place was unthinkable. Charms and relics became the traveller's defence. Pilgrims wore badges of saints or carried small relics, a splinter of wood, a fragment of bone, a scrap of cloth, believing these would guard them against evil. Merchants carried amulets to ward off curses. Even ordinary peasants might stitch protective symbols into their cloaks, or carry a sprig of herbs against witchcraft. For all their weight and discomfort, such tokens were thought essential, as important as food or water. Witches, of course, were a constant fear. A sudden sickness, a spoiled meal, or a broken wheel on the road could all be blamed on a curse. Travellers told tales of old women in lonely huts, offering shelter only to hex their guests by morning. Some claimed witches could summon storms, leading travellers astray with lights in the forest or whispers on the wind. Whether real or imagined, the fear was enough to make many avoid solitary houses or strange encounters altogether. Dreams, too, were taken seriously. A dream of falling was a warning of misfortune ahead. To dream of blood meant violence. To dream of a shadowy figure meant death. A traveller who awoke from such visions often delayed their journey, choosing to wait rather than tempt fate. Even the church, which condemned superstition, encouraged fear of unseen dangers. Priests warned of demons lurking in wild places, eager to snatch the souls of the unwary. Pilgrims were told their suffering was a test, that the devil himself tried to turn them back from holy shrines. Every misstep or hardship could be interpreted as spiritual warfare, invisible yet deadly. Weather signs were read with anxious eyes. A sudden storm cloud could mean God's anger. Lightning striking near the road was taken as a warning. Rainbows, on the other hand, were read as blessings, encouragement to continue. The sky itself was a living text, filled with divine messages for those who dared to look. Animals became messengers too. A black dog crossing your path was unlucky. A snake in the road was an evil omen. Even harmless creatures like hares or foxes were watched carefully, their behaviour seen as signs of what lay ahead. The road was alive with symbols, each one capable of steering a traveller's decisions. Such beliefs may sound strange now, but in a world where death was near at every step, they offered comfort. If disaster struck, it was not meaningless, it was fate, or a curse, or the devil's hand. And if one survived, it was proof of divine favor. For the medieval traveler, superstition was not foolishness. It was survival, a way to make sense of chaos. Every prayer whispered at a crossroads, every relic kissed before a river crossing, every omen carefully heeded was part of the fragile shield against the unknown. Because on the road, even when no blade was drawn and no storm clouds gathered, fear travelled beside you, the fear of things unseen, watching from the shadows. In the Middle Ages, the road was not only dangerous because of bandits, storms, or disease. Sometimes the greatest danger came from the very tools of travel themselves, the horse beneath you, or the cart you trusted to carry your load. What we see today as symbols of freedom and movement were, in the medieval world, constant sources of peril. To begin with, horses were costly treasures, not common possessions. A peasant might never ride one in his lifetime, while merchants and knights relied on them daily. But even the most well-trained horse could be unpredictable. A sudden clap of thunder, the crack of a branch, or the sight of a wolf at the roadside could send a horse bolting in panic. A rider thrown from the saddle risked broken bones, shattered skulls, or worse. In a world without modern medicine, even a simple fracture could spell the end of a journey or of life itself. Carts brought their own hazards. Constructed of heavy wood, bound by iron, and pulled by oxen or horses, they creaked and rattled over uneven ground. The roads were rutted, muddy, and often broken by rocks or holes. Wheels splintered. Axles snapped. When a cart overturned on a steep hill, the load might crush those nearby. A single accident could kill travellers and destroy all their goods in an instant. Consider the plight of a merchant hauling wares to market. His cart is laden with wool, salt, or grain. The road narrows, climbing a stony slope. The oxen strain, the cart lurches, and with a groan the axle gives way. The cart tips. Bales roll downhill, smashing into rocks. The merchant leaps aside, but one of his servants is not so lucky, pinned beneath the wheel, bones broken beyond repair. The journey ends not with profit, but with loss and grief. Even without accidents, carts slowed travellers dangerously. Bandits often struck when wagons became stuck in mud or struggled up steep paths. A broken cart on a lonely road was an invitation to disaster. Repair was difficult, spare parts were rare, and craftsmen far between. A snapped wheel could mean abandoning both goods and cart, leaving a traveller with nothing but what he could carry on his back. Horses themselves were fragile companions. Lameness from a stone lodged in the hoof, illness from poor fodder, or injury from overwork could cripple an animal. For a knight, losing a warhorse meant disaster in battle. For a pilgrim, it meant trudging onward on weary feet. And for a merchant, it often meant ruin, as goods that once rolled smoothly now had to be dragged or abandoned. Travel at night magnified the dangers. A rider guiding his horse by torchlight could not see the pitfalls of the road. One misstep into a ditch, and horse and rider might tumble together. In forests, roots tangled hooves. In marshlands, animals sank into mud, dragging carts down with them. Travellers sometimes awoke to find their beasts drowned in bogs. Their journey ended before it had truly begun. Superstition added a darker edge to these risks. A stumbling horse was seen as a bad omen, a warning of danger ahead. Some believed carts that broke down repeatedly were cursed. Others whispered that witches could hex wheels, ensuring disaster for those who passed. To lose a horse suddenly, without clear cause, was often blamed not on illness, but on sorcery. Accidents carried not just physical danger, but economic ruin. Horses were expensive to buy and keep. Carts cost months of labour to build. To lose one was a blow from which few could recover. Merchants faced bankruptcy. Pilgrims were stranded. Poor travellers, unable to replace what was lost, might simply give up, their journey ending in despair. And yet, Horses and carts were unavoidable. Roads were long, burdens heavy, and speed essential. Travellers accepted the risks because they had no choice. But each time a rider mounted or a cart rumbled onto a rutted track, a silent gamble began. Would the beast remain steady? Would the wheels hold? Or would the road claim another victim in its endless tally of broken bones and broken lives? For the medieval traveller, even the very means of movement was treacherous. To trust a horse or a cart was to trust chance itself, and chance was rarely kind. If the roads of medieval Europe were fraught with danger, the seas were even worse. To set foot on a ship in the Middle Ages was to place your life in the hands of wind, water, and fate. Where land travel brought risks of bandits, hunger, and broken carts, the sea brought storms, pirates, and shipwrecks that could swallow entire crews without a trace. For the traveller, the ocean was not a blue highway. It was a graveyard waiting to claim the unwary. Medieval ships were fragile compared to what came later. They were wooden hulks, built with limited knowledge of hydrodynamics, and constantly at the mercy of the weather. Sails tore easily, ropes frayed, and leaks opened in the hull without warning. A storm could splinter a vessel like kindling. Lightning, winds, and towering waves turned journeys into desperate battles for survival. Sailors and passengers alike prayed to God and saints, for in those moments no human skill seemed enough. Storms were not the only hazard. Navigation itself was primitive. Without compasses in the early Middle Ages, sailors relied on stars, landmarks, and memory. A foggy night could spell disaster, with ships running aground on unseen reefs or cliffs. Many journeys ended, not in safe harbour, but in shattered wood and drowned bodies scattered along the shoreline. Pirates and raiders were an ever-present fear. The North Sea and English Channel swarmed with opportunists who preyed on merchants. In the Mediterranean, Saracen pirates, Byzantine warships, and later corsairs struck fear into travellers. Ships were boarded, goods stolen, passengers taken for ransom or slavery. For those captured, the journey ended not in death, but in chains. Even on peaceful voyages, disease haunted the cramped decks. Dozens of people crowded together in filthy conditions, with little food and foul water. Dysentery spread quickly, weakening crews before storms or attackers even struck. Rats, fleas, and lice thrived, carrying sickness from one port to another. The Black Death itself spread in part by sea, riding the same ships that carried pilgrims and merchants. Food and water on board were meagre. Passengers ate salted fish, stale bread, and thin gruel. Fresh water grew slimy in its barrels, fouled by mould and insects. Many went hungry, stomachs knotted with sickness. Scurvy, though not yet understood, slowly robbed sailors of their teeth and strength. A long voyage was less a journey and more an endurance trial. Superstition was powerful at sea. Sailors refused to whistle, fearing it would summon storms. Black cats, women on board, or even uttering certain words were thought to bring bad luck. Many ships bore religious symbols, crosses painted on sails, or saints' relics nailed to masts, to guard against evil. Travellers who boarded such ships stepped not only into the hands of sailors, but into the unseen world of faith and fear. For pilgrims travelling to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Jerusalem, sea voyages were unavoidable. Many never arrived. Storms drowned them. Pirates captured them. Disease consumed them before land was sighted. Yet still they came, driven by faith strong enough to risk the sea's hunger. The bones of the lost littered coasts across Europe, silent testimony to the cost of such devotion. Merchants, too, faced ruin on the water. A single storm could swallow fortunes of wool, wine, or spices. Families on shore might never know what became of their loved ones, only that they vanished with the ship. Maritime insurance, a practice just beginning in the later Middle Ages, existed because loss was so constant it could bankrupt whole trading houses. And yet, for all its dangers, the sea was irresistible. It connected kingdoms, brought wealth, and carried pilgrims to salvation. Those who survived spoke of the terror with awe, their voices carrying both pride and sorrow. To travel by sea was to stare death in the face, and sometimes live to tell of it. For the medieval traveller, the sea was both an opportunity and nightmare. Each voyage began with a prayer and often ended with screams lost to the wind. On land, the road might kill you. At sea, the ocean waited to claim you whole. On the medieval road, a man's greatest fear was often not storm or starvation, but other men. Among them, none were dreaded more than the outlaw, the person cast beyond the law, who lived by plunder, violence, and terror. To encounter one on your journey could mean losing your coin, your horse, your freedom, or your life. Outlawry in the Middle Ages was not merely a matter of crime, it was a punishment. A man declared an outlaw was stripped of all legal protection. He could be killed without consequence, his property seized, his family disgraced. He was no longer considered part of the community of Christendom, but a hunted beast. Yet this punishment only made him more dangerous, for to survive he had no choice but to steal. And where better to steal than the lonely, vulnerable roads of medieval Europe? Travellers whispered stories of infamous bands. Some roamed the forests, waiting in ambush for merchants heavy with goods. Others lurked near bridges and toll gates, posing as guards before turning on their victims. Many worked with silent approval from corrupt nobles who looked the other way as long as the stolen silver found its way into their coffers. For the traveller, there was little defence beyond prayer and luck. Exile was another fate to be dreaded. Banishment from one's town or kingdom was often a slower death than execution. To be driven from home meant becoming a stranger everywhere. Foreign villages treated outsiders with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. Without family ties, without guild or parish, an exile was left unprotected. On the road, he was marked as prey, vulnerable to bandits, wolves, and hunger alike. Imagine the plight of such a man. Cast out for debt or for some crime, he wanders with no place to rest. Each town gate closes at his approach. Inns refuse him shelter. Farmers clutch their tools, fearing theft. His only companions are other exiles, beggars, and vagabonds, outcasts who form fragile bands, sometimes for survival, often for crime. For the ordinary traveller who crossed paths with them, danger was certain. Even those not formally outlawed could fall into lawlessness. Wars left many men dispossessed, armed, and desperate. Soldiers returning from campaigns often had no land or lord to serve, and so turned to robbery. In regions torn by conflict, bands of such men roamed like wolves, more dangerous than any wild beast. Their knowledge of weapons and tactics made them skilled predators. The church and the crown alike feared the growing numbers of outlaws. They were a threat not only to travellers, but to order itself. Sermons denounced them as tools of the devil. Kings offered pardons to those who surrendered, but only if they served in war. Those who refused were hunted down like vermin, their heads displayed on city gates as a warning. Yet for every band destroyed, another rose in the forests. For travellers, the threat was constant. A pilgrim carrying offerings, a merchant with loaded carts, even a poor peasant moving between villages, all were fair game. Some tried to defend themselves by travelling in groups or hiring guards, but not everyone could afford such protection. Most walked the roads with nothing but a walking stick, eyes fixed nervously on the trees that might conceal their doom. Superstition magnified the fear. Outlaws were sometimes said to be in league with demons, their lives beyond the law mirrored by their damnation in the afterlife. A man who had killed without mercy might be believed to walk even after death, haunting the forests where he had shed blood. To meet an outlaw was to meet not just a man, but a curse. And yet, outlawry carried a strange allure as well. Ballads told of clever thieves who outwitted greedy lords, of noble bandits who shared their loot with the poor. Such tales softened the horror in song and story, but the truth on the road was far more brutal. Few travellers would sing of the outlaw if they had faced one's knife in the dark. For the medieval traveller, outlaws and exiles embodied the greatest human danger, desperation unchecked by law. They were reminders that the road stripped away all safety, leaving every man to fend for himself. And in the shadow of the woods, a desperate man was often the deadliest foe of all. Not all medieval roads were created equal. For the traveller, the choice between a royal road and a wild path could mean the difference between life and death. Each carried its own dangers, but while one offered the fragile promise of safety under the king's authority, the other was a gamble with the untamed world. Royal roads, or viae regii, were the arteries of kingdoms. They connected major towns, castles, and markets. By decree, they were meant to be maintained and protected, with tolls collected for their upkeep, and soldiers sometimes patrolling their stretches. Along them, travellers could find inns, markets, and shrines, waypoints of civilization in an otherwise hostile world. On paper, they were the safest choice. But even these royal roads were far from secure. Patrols were rare, and brigands clever. Many lay in wait just beyond the edges of the road, springing upon travellers before melting back into the woods. Toll-keepers themselves were sometimes corrupt, turning a blind eye to robbery in exchange for a share of the spoils, and the very popularity of the royal roads made them attractive targets. A merchant loaded with goods was far more likely to use a main road than a hidden track. Then there were the wild paths. Narrow, twisting tracks through forests, hills, and marshlands. They offered secrecy but demanded risk. Those who feared ambush on the main road sometimes took these lesser paths, hoping to pass unseen. Yet danger lay in their very isolation. A broken wheel, a lame horse, or even a sprained ankle could leave a traveller stranded with no one to help. Wolves prowled the forests, and robbers too, though fewer in number, they were often more ruthless, for they hunted where no witness could see. Superstition thickened in these lonely routes. Travellers feared spirits at crossroads, witches' huts deep in the trees, or haunted clearings where executions had once taken place. To walk a wild path at dusk was to feel the eyes of the unseen pressing from every shadow. Even seasoned wanderers lit candles or muttered prayers before stepping off the safety of the king's highway. Royal roads, for all their hazards, at least offered signs of human presence. Stone markers sometimes guided travellers, carved crosses reassured pilgrims, and bridges, when not collapsing, provided safer crossings than the fords of wild rivers. Inns clustered along these routes, though often overpriced and unsafe, still gave some shelter. Churches and monasteries opened their doors to those who claimed to be pilgrims, and shrines dotted the roadsides, offering travellers a place to kneel and beg for protection. Wild paths had none of these comforts. A traveller followed them at his own peril, guided only by memory, rumour, or the advice of locals who might not be trustworthy. Maps were crude at best, often little more than sketches, and compasses were rare until later centuries. To wander off the wild path, even by a little, was to risk getting hopelessly lost. Many never found their way back. Yet necessity often forced the choice. Merchants with contraband, smugglers, or fugitives preferred wild routes to avoid tolls and patrols. Poor pilgrims too, unable to pay the fees demanded on the king's road, trudged through dangerous woods instead. In times of war, armies controlled the main highways, making wild paths the only option for those trying to avoid soldiers. The difference between the two was not only practical, but symbolic. The royal road represented the thin reach of law, the king's authority stretching into the countryside. The wild path represented freedom, but also lawlessness, the untamed spaces where neither king nor priest could protect you. For the medieval traveller, every journey demanded a decision. Do you take the royal road, where robbers wait in plain sight, or the wild path, where beasts and solitude might kill you just as easily? Neither choice guaranteed survival. Both carried risk, and both reminded the traveller of a hard truth. In the Middle Ages, no road was truly safe. The dangers of medieval travel were not only written in broken bones, hunger, or steel. They were also carved into the mind. For the traveller, fear was a constant companion, one that lingered long after the road was behind them. To journey far from home was not only a physical ordeal, but a psychological one, a steady erosion of spirit under the weight of uncertainty and dread. Loneliness was the first and most insidious threat. Few travelled with large groups, many were alone, or with only a companion or two. Days stretched into weeks, with little more than the crunch of footsteps or the creak of a cart for company. The silence of forests pressed heavy on the soul, broken only by distant howls or sudden rustlings that sent shivers through the spine. Even when travelling in company, fear could isolate a man, making him wary of strangers who might be friend or foe. Sleep was rarely restful. Inns were noisy, filthy, and unsafe, while nights spent outdoors brought the unease of exposure. Every snapping twig in the dark might be a wolf or a thief. Few could sleep deeply when a single careless moment might mean disaster. The constant watchfulness frayed nerves, leaving travellers short-tempered, paranoid, and exhausted. Fear of betrayal gnawed at those who shared the road with others. Fellow travellers could as easily turn to robbery as offer aid. Strangers at inns eyed one another warily, clutching purses beneath their cloaks, never sure who might be plotting theft by night. Trust was a luxury most could not afford, and suspicion poisoned even the smallest encounters. The endless hardships wore down hope. Hunger made tempers short, thirst made every mile a torment. A broken cart or lame horse was not merely an inconvenience, it was despair. The knowledge that no one would come to help, that your suffering was invisible to the world, left travellers hollow and bitter. Many turned to prayer, clinging to faith as the only rope binding them to sanity. Superstition deepened the strain. Every raven overhead, every stumble at the start of a journey, every dream of death weighed heavily. Believing the world was full of signs and omens meant seeing danger everywhere, even in the innocent. A cracked wheel was not just misfortune, it was a curse. A stranger's kindness might hide witchcraft. The burden of belief was heavy, and it shaped every step with fear. War heightened the toll. Passing through a land scarred by conflict meant constant tension fields burned, soldiers roaming, villages emptied. A wrong accent could make you a spy, a wrong emblem could make you a traitor. Travellers lived with the knowledge that they could be seized, questioned, or executed without trial. To walk such roads was to walk in constant dread. The psychological strain could twist into madness. Chronic exhaustion, hunger, and fear pushed some travellers into delirium. Tales tell of pilgrims who claimed to see demons in the woods, of merchants who became convinced they were cursed, of wanderers who abandoned companions and vanished into the wilderness, broken by the weight of fear. And yet, for many, the greatest toll was the erosion of humanity itself. Constant danger hardened travellers, making them suspicious, selfish, even cruel. A man who once would have shared bread might hoard it, convinced he would starve otherwise. A companion left behind after an accident might once have been mourned, but on the road they became just another weight cast aside. The road stripped away gentleness, leaving only what survival demanded. But there were those who endured and even found strength in hardship. Pilgrims believed their suffering brought them closer to God. Merchants saw each successful journey as proof of their skill and resilience. To survive the psychological gauntlet of travel was, in a way, to be remade scarred, but also tempered. Still, the cost was undeniable. For the medieval traveller, the road was not only a physical trial, it was a battle of the mind, fought in silence and shadows. Long after the journey ended, many carried its echoes nightmares of storms, of footsteps in the dark, of endless hunger. The road marked not just the body, but the soul. For all the terrors of medieval travel, the bandits, the storms, the wolves, the hunger, not every journey ended in ruin. Against all odds, some travellers triumphed. Their stories were rare, but they shone like sparks in the darkness, proof that survival and even prosperity was possible on the dangerous roads of the Middle Ages. Merchants in particular had much to gain. A successful trip could mean riches beyond imagination. A wagon laden with wool from England might fetch a fortune in Flanders. A caravan carrying spices from the East could make a family wealthy for generations. For every merchant who fell to bandits, another returned home to cheers, their coffers heavy with coins. These success stories inspired others to brave the road, even as the risks destroyed countless lives. Pilgrims, too, found triumph, though theirs was measured not in gold, but in faith. To survive a journey to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or even Jerusalem was considered proof of divine favour. Pilgrims returned home carrying badges, relics, or simply tales of their ordeal, admired by neighbours as holy travellers who had faced the dangers of the road and prevailed. The pilgrimage was both an ordeal and reward, a spiritual victory won through suffering. Knights also carved out success upon the roads. Many travelled far to join tournaments or crusades, earning glory and renown. To ride safely through hostile lands, to return with trophies or with honour intact, was the dream of every warrior. Songs and poems immortalised their feats, though they left out the hunger, the mud, and the fear that were constant companions on those same journeys. Even humble peasants sometimes returned with victories of their own. A labourer who walked to a distant town to find work might send coins back to his starving family. A farmer who risked selling grain at a far-off market could double his profit, feeding his village through winter. Their names were not sung in ballads, but their survival was as miraculous as any knight's tale. There were also stories of unexpected kindness. Some travellers told of villages that took them in during famine, of monks who gave bread and wine freely, of strangers who shared fires and stories on lonely nights. Such moments were rare, but when they came, they transformed the road from a place of fear into a fleeting vision of fellowship. For those who survived, these memories became more precious than gold. The success stories were told and retold, often embellished. A merchant who returned alive became not just wealthy, but a legend among his peers. A pilgrim who completed his vow was celebrated as a living saint. Their tales encouraged others to attempt the same, even though the odds were stacked against them. Hope, after all, is a powerful fuel, and without it, few would have dared to set out at all. But we must remember, success was measured differently in the Middle Ages than today. To return home alive was already a victory. To arrive with your goods intact was a triumph. To reach a holy shrine and touch the relic of a saint was the achievement of a lifetime. The bar for success was set low because the risks were so high. And yet, even these rare successes carried scars. Merchants returned richer, but often wary and hardened, their minds marked by close escapes. Pilgrims returned with faith strengthened, but also haunted by the sights of death along the road. The victories were real, but they came at a cost, paid in fear, hardship, and memory. Still, these stories mattered. They gave shape to the dream of the road, not just as a place of suffering, but as a path to transformation. To survive travel in the Middle Ages was to prove one's resilience, whether measured in coin, faith, or simple endurance. These rare survivors gave others hope, even if their own lives had been forever changed. For most, the medieval road was a trial that ended in silence. But for a few, it was the path to wealth, holiness, or honor. Their voices carried across taverns and marketplaces, keeping alive the idea that, just maybe, the road could give as well as take. We've walked the roads of the Middle Ages, muddy tracks, shadowed forests, and treacherous rivers. Bandits, wolves, hunger, and storms haunted every step. To travel then was not freedom, it was survival, and often a losing gamble. Behind the romantic tales of knights and pilgrims lay the harsh truth: broken roads, false maps, strangers who could turn deadly. A single slip, a bad meal, or the wrong inn could end a life. The uncertainty was the greatest terror, never knowing if the next bend would bring safety or death. And yet, people travelled. Merchants risked all for profit. Pilgrims limped toward salvation. Messengers and knights braved the unknown for duty and honor. Every journey carried the chance of ruin, but also transformation. Today, we worry about traffic and delays. For them, survival itself was a victory. Every mile walked was a prayer. Every safe return was a triumph. So the next time you set out on the road, spare a thought for those travellers of old. Their world is gone, but their fears still echo. Because in the Middle Ages, the road was not freedom. It was fate, and fate was rarely kind.